Welcome to Hungarian Insights, your go-to channel for exploring Hungary's rich history, vibrant culture, and language learning resources. Whether you're a student planning to study in Hungary, an expat eager to grasp the nation's heritage, an individual preparing for the Hungarian citizenship exam, or a bilingual student seeking to complement your studies, our podcasts serve as a captivating starting point, and our smart, modern learning tips and resources are tailored to make your journey enjoyable and effective. In this episode, we uncover the topic of the Rákosi era and the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. We examine the struggle against Soviet control and its impact on Hungary's political and cultural landscape. Let's dive in.
All right, so get ready to dive deep
Yeah.
into a period of Hungarian history.
All right.
That's both fascinating and heartbreaking.
Yeah,
The Rákosi era and the 1956 revolution.
definitely.
We're talking about a nation that's grappling with the aftermath of World War II, finding itself under Soviet control,
Right.
and ultimately fighting for its very identity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And what's so captivating about this period is how closely intertwined Hungarian politics are with really the global tensions of the Cold War. You know, it's a story of power struggles, ideology, and this yearning for freedom,
Right.
all playing out on
Yeah.
a very human stage.
So let's paint a picture for our listener here.
Okay.
Imagine Hungary in 1945. World War II has just ended. The country is in ruins.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this looming presence of the Soviet Union.
Right.
Not exactly a recipe for a smooth transition.
No, not at all. You have a nation that's trying to rebuild
Right.
physically and emotionally.
Yeah.
But suddenly under the thumb of a totalitarian regime.
Okay.
This is where Matthias Rákosi enters the scene, a hardline communist, totally devoted to Stalin's model, and he quickly establishes a system that mirrors the Soviet Union.
So we're talking about a complete transformation of Hungarian society.
Absolutely.
What did this actually look like for everyday people?
I think a good way to think about it is you wake up one day
Yep.
and everything's different. Your farm is collectivized.
Wow.
Your free speech is gone. And there's this constant fear of the secret police, the FH. It's like living in a shadow, always looking over your shoulder.
That's heavy stuff. But then Stalin dies in 1953.
Yeah.
And things start to shift a little bit, right?
Yeah. Across the Soviet bloc, there's this period of de-Stalinization.
Right.
It's like a crack in the ice, a slight thawing. And in Hungary, Emre Nagy, who is seen as a reformer within the Communist Party,
Okay.
becomes prime minister.
All right, so Nagy comes in, and some things are starting to look up. He
Yeah.
implements reforms.
He did some pretty bold things, actually. He releases political prisoners,
Okay?
allows some criticism of the government, even tries to improve the lives of workers and farmers,
Right.
addressing their economic concerns. And people see this and think maybe, just maybe, things are really changing.
It's like a breath of fresh air after years of living under this oppressive atmosphere.
Absolutely.
But this is Hungary,
Yeah.
a nation with a history of fighting for its independence. Could it really be that easy?
You're right to be skeptical. Nagy's reforms are seen as a threat
Right.
by the hardliners within the party,
Yep.
those still loyal to Rákosi's vision. And they're not going to sit back and watch their power slip away.
So what happens? Does the pendulum swing back?
It does. Nagy's reforms go too far for the party elite, and they managed to oust him from power in 1955.
Wow. So those hopes for a more liberal Hungary are dashed,
Yeah,
and the country is thrust back into this climate of fear and uncertainty.
unfortunately so.
Yeah, I bet the frustration was palpable. They're given this glimpse of what life could be like,
Right.
only to have it ripped away. Talk about a setup for simmering resentment.
Absolutely.
But how do we get from that simmering resentment to this full-blown revolution?
Well, remember, this is the Cold War. Information might be controlled,
Right.
but it still manages to seep through. Hungarian students and intellectuals are keenly aware of what's happening in Poland.
Interesting.
They see protests, the demands for reform, and they're inspired.
Okay.
Plus, they haven't forgotten what life was like under Nagy, that brief moment of hope.
So they see Poland as this potential path forward. Do they start organizing their own protests?
Yeah, making demands for similar reforms.
And were their demands purely political? Or was there this deeper social and economic element at play as well?
It was both. Initially, they wanted these basic freedoms.
Okay.
Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and end to the secret police.
Mm-hmm.
But they also wanted improvements in living standards, better working conditions.
Right.
It's a mix of wanting this political change and a more just society.
All right, so the students, they're the catalyst, right?
Yeah, they take to the streets first, hoping for dialogue with the government.
Okay, so they try the peaceful protest route, hoping for a dialogue.
Right.
But remember, this is a regime that's used to ruling through fear and intimidation.
Absolutely.
So what's their response?
Well, they send in the AVH,
Oh, man.
the dreaded secret police, to break up the demonstrations.
So instead of listening to the students, the regime doubles down on repression.
Right.
I imagine that didn't exactly calm things down. Was that the turning point?
Absolutely. The moment the AVH opens fire on the demonstrators, everything changes. It's like this match thrown into a pile of dry tinder,
Right.
the pent-up frustration, the anger, the desire for change. It all explodes into this
Wow.
spontaneous nationwide uprising.
From student protests to a full-blown revolution, it sounds like things went from 0 to 60 in a matter of days.
Yes, very quickly.
Who joins this uprising? Is it just the students, or is it a broader cross-section?
It's not just the students, workers, intellectuals, everyday Hungarians, they all join in. They're fed up with the regime, with the Soviet control, with the lack of freedom and opportunity. It becomes a truly national movement cutting across social and economic lines. And in a stunning turn of events, they demand the return of Imre Nagy.
Wait, they want Nagy back, the guy who was ousted just a year earlier.
They do.
That's incredible. They must have seen him as this symbol of hope.
Right. A chance for a different future.
What does Nagy do? Does he embrace this revolution, or is he hesitant to get involved again?
He embraces it. And he makes some incredibly bold moves. He declares Hungary neutral,
Okay.
announces their withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact.
Wow.
He's essentially severing ties with the Soviet bloc, taking this gamble that the Soviets won't intervene.
Talk about high-stakes poker. What was the international reaction?
Well, the world's watching, but
Mhm.
no one really knows how to react. The West is torn between supporting this yearning for freedom
Right.
and the fear of provoking a wider conflict with the Soviet Union. It's this delicate balancing act.
Yeah.
And ultimately, they choose not to intervene directly.
Which leaves Nagy and the Hungarian people in a very precarious position.
Yeah, it does.
Okay, so the stage is set for this showdown. We have the revolution in full swing, a leader making bold moves, a world watching but hesitant to act, and of course the looming president of the Soviet Union.
Right.
This is where things get really interesting, right?
It is. The question is, will the Soviets allow this challenge to their authority to stand, or will they crush this fledgling revolution before it can fully take flight?
So last time we left off with Hungary in the midst of this incredible revolution, Imre Nagy making these bold declarations
Yeah.
and the Soviet Union looming large in the background. What happens next?
Well, initially, there's some hesitation on their part. Remember, this is the Cold War,
Right.
and the last thing they want is this global incident. But ultimately, they're not going to let a satellite state just slip away. They see this revolution as a direct threat to their power. Then influence in Eastern Europe.
So they decide to act. What does that look like?
Well, they try some initial maneuvers,
Okay.
trying to gauge the strength of the revolution, maybe even sow some discord within the Hungarian leadership. But
Right.
let's be real, they've already made up their minds. On November 4th, 1956, Soviet tanks roll into Budapest.
Talk about a gut punch. Here these Hungarians are fighting for their freedom, their independence,
Right.
and suddenly they're facing the full might of the Soviet military. What chance did they have?
Not much, to be honest. It was a David and Goliath situation.
Yeah.
And in this case, Goliath had all the firepower. The Hungarian resistance fighters, they were brave, they were determined, but they were just outmatched.
It must have been terrifying for those caught in the middle of all this. I mean, imagine seeing tanks rolling through your city,
Absolutely.
buildings being destroyed, people fleeing for their lives.
It was a brutal period. There was street fighting, there were casualties on both sides, and a lot of innocent civilians
Right.
were caught in the crossfire. The revolution was effectively crushed
Wow.
within a matter of days.
So what happens to Nagy? I mean, he basically thumbed his nose at the Soviets, declared Hungary independent.
Right.
What's his fate?
Well, sadly, it's not a happy ending for Nagy. He's arrested, accused of treason, and eventually executed in 1958.
Wow.
A lot of other revolutionaries meet similar fates: imprisonment, exile, or worse.
It's a tragic end to this brief moment of hope. What about the everyday Hungarians who participated in the uprising? What were the long-term consequences for them?
Well, the aftermath of the revolution was a period of repression and retributions. The Soviets installed a new leader, János Kadar,
Okay.
who was tasked with bringing Hungary back into line. He cracks down on any dissent, purges the party of those deemed unreliable, and essentially reinstates a hardline communist regime.
So it's back to square one, back to living under the shadow of Soviet control. But is it really the same as before the revolution? Did the events of '56 change anything in the long run?
That's a great question. On the surface, it might seem like the revolution was a complete failure. The Soviets reasserted their dominance, the reformers were silenced, and Hungary remained firmly within the Soviet bloc.
But you're hinting that there's more to the story, right?
Exactly, the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, even though it was brutally crushed, it had this ripple effect.
Okay.
It shattered the myth of Soviet invincibility. It showed the world that people, even in the face of overwhelming odds, were willing to fight for their freedom.
So it was this symbolic victory, a testament to the human spirit even in defeat. Did it have any practical impact on how the Soviets ruled Eastern Europe?
Yeah, in a way, the Soviets realized that brute force alone wasn't enough to maintain control.
Okay.
They had to offer some concessions, some semblance of economic and social liberalization
Right.
to prevent another Hungary from happening.
Interesting. So it's like the revolution forced the Soviets to rethink their strategy.
Right. They couldn't just rely on fear and intimidation anymore. They had to offer something, even
Yeah.
if it was just a facade of freedom to keep the population from revolting again.
Exactly. And this had a lasting impact on life in Hungary.
It did, and other Eastern European countries, the Khadr regime, for example, while still authoritarian, wasn't as brutally repressive as the Rákosi era.
Okay.
There was the slight easing of censorship, some economic reforms, even a bit more freedom to travel.
So a slightly softer version of communism. But was it enough to quell the desire for true freedom, for genuine democracy? Or was that yearning just simmering beneath the surface?
That's a question that would continue to haunt Hungary, and indeed the entire Soviet bloc, for decades to come.
Right.
The seeds of dissent had been sown, and while they might have been dormant for a time, they were far from eradicated.
It's fascinating how this one event, the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, had such a profound impact, not just on Hungary itself, but on this broader Cold War dynamic.
Absolutely.
It's a reminder that even in defeat, the fight for freedom can leave an indelible mark on history.
And it sets the stage for what's to come, the eventual unraveling of the Soviet Empire
Yeah.
and the emergence of a new Europe. But that's a story for another deep dive.
I think that's a great place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground, from the initial Soviet takeover to the hope and heartbreak of the revolution, and the long shadow it cast over Hungary's future. Stay tuned, because when we come back, we're going to explore how this tumultuous period shaped Hungarian art, literature, and music. How did artists and writers grapple with the trauma of the Rákosi era and the legacy of the 1956 revolution? That's what we'll be unpacking in our final segment.
Our podcast discussions are based on our eBook, Hungary's Hall of Fame in a Nutshell. History, literature, art, music, science, sport. Scan the QR code or check the link in the description to download your copy of Hungary's Hall of Fame in a Nutshell. As a special bonus, you'll also receive the Illustrated Companion, featuring over 100 detailed illustrations to visually enrich your understanding of the book's content. Thank you for watching.